Okay, so welcome all to the fourth and final research forum on aging for 2020. It's great to see so many people are able to join us. We've got about 40 attendees so far, so a very big welcome. If this is the first forum that you've been to, or if you're a regular forum attender. My name's Paul Willis. I'm a senior lecturer in social work in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, and I'm part of the planning group for this forum. So for those of you who are not familiar with the forum, this forum has been operating in the Bristol area for over 25 years now, and it represents a local collaboration between the University of West of England, University of Bristol, Brunel Care, and Bristol Age UK. We hold 3 to 4 forums every year where we focus on topics specific to aging and older people. And we want to highlight current research findings, messages and evidence that would help inform and improve practice and support to older citizens in Bristol and indeed UK and potentially internationally. Because of all the challenges that we've had with COVID-19 this year, we've moved our forums online, so we have been finding our way through the forms of webinars like today's. And we're going to have a survey to share with you later on in the forum, just so we can gather your feedback and your views about how well this is working. And we also like to hear from people attending about what topics we should focus on. So later on, we'd like to hear from you about what topics we should focus on for 2021 as we start to plan ahead. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Just a couple of things to go over. If you have a webcam and if you've got the internet to support it, we encourage you to turn your webcam on. But that's your choice, of course. Everyone's microphones will be muted throughout the forum. Please, we really welcome questions for the speakers. Both our speakers today are going to present one after the other. But if you type a question in the chat box to everybody and put a Q before your question, then we'll make a note of those questions and we'll come back to those questions at the end of the presentations when we have some question, answer and discussion time. If you run into any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to send a direct message to Gary Christopher. So if you go to the chat box, there'll be an option to message someone privately and you'll find Gary's name listed there as one of the co-hosts. And just to let everybody know, this event is being recorded and it'll be made available for others to view through the Age UK Bristol website. And this research forum also has its own YouTube page. So it will be made available there. So you'll be able to look back over this presentation and look at some of the PowerPoint slides at your own time at a later date. We're also delighted to have Suzanne, who's providing captions for us. So this forum does have captions, but you'll need to click on the CC closed captions button at the bottom of your page to switch that on if they're not already appearing at the bottom of the page. So just keep a lookout for the CC closed captions. Likewise, if you want to switch that off, you should be able to do that through that same CC button. Okay, so that's the housekeeping. I'm delighted to welcome 2 speakers today, Ailsa Cameron from the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, and Jessica Duffy from the Time to Shine program at Leeds. Jessica and Ailsa, we're really delighted you can be with us today. Today's forum is focusing on the topic of volunteering and volunteer support for older adults. And we know, particularly this year, how important the role of volunteers has been in providing really crucial care and support to older people across local areas, across their neighbourhoods, and indeed virtually as well, as we've had to change the ways in which volunteers engage with older people in recent months. So given the impact of COVID-19 and the impact of lockdown on older people's social connections and relationships with others, we thought it was really timely and important to focus on this topic of volunteering and the value and role of volunteers in this area. So I'm going to invite Ailsa Cameron to share her screen.
Okay.
That's great, Elsa. So as I mentioned before, Elsa's a teaching member and a researcher in social care and social policy in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. Elsa's going to be talking about her research project that she's led on the contribution of volunteers in social care for older people. So Elsa, welcome, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And it's nice to join everybody from my kitchen. And it's nice to see some of my co-researchers in the audience. So first off, the original backdrop to this study was a growing awareness of the increasing use of volunteers in social care for older people, and concern about the use of volunteers to fill gaps in provision in what was already a very challenging financial context. And as Paul has already said, in recent months, we've all appreciated the contribution made by volunteers to support members of our community. But my concerns about the appropriateness of volunteers filling gaps in provision have intensified. And that's largely because of the extent of underfunding across all welfare services that have laid bare, as a result of COVID, the kind of state of the sector, and also the continued failure of government to address the fundamental problem of a lack of funding for this sector. So the idea, as I've said, came from an observation that all of us in the team, Paul, Liz, Randall, Ellie, and I, had all made, that volunteers were being used or were contributing to social care provision. And what we wanted to find out was what sort of roles volunteers play, what the motivations were from managers.
Hi, Elsa. Sorry to interrupt. We're having a little bit of trouble with the audio. It's coming across a bit crackly and a bit muted. Are you there, Elsa? Oh dear, it seems Elsa has frozen. Gary, Claire, other people experiencing that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I'm just going to send a message to Elsa. See if I
Okay.
can.
Jessica, are you in a position to start your presentation? Would that be?
If I unmute myself, I am. Yes, I could do that while Elsa wrestles with her tech, which of course worked before we started. So.
It did work before we started. So, okay, well, what we might do, Gary and I will liaise with Elsa.
Right, I'll share my screen.
And over to Jessica. So welcome Jessica Duffy from the Time to Shine program from Leeds. Delighted you can present our forum today. And I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you today on this webinar. My name's Jessica and I work for an organisation called Time to Shine, which is based in Leeds. It's the equivalent of Bristol Ageing Better programme down where you are. And we've been looking at what happened to volunteering during the COVID-19 process with the delivery partners who deliver the Time to Shine project with older people here in Leeds. And it's, I think probably, I was really hoping to hear Elsa first. I should be interested to hear what she's talking about. Ours is not a research project as such, it's reporting on what actually happened face to face in a qualitative way. So following lockdown, older people's organisations in Leeds, as I'm sure in Bristol, reacted very quickly. They changed their deliveries to support the most vulnerable clients in their own homes. This required a different approach to volunteering, especially as for many of the organisations, particularly those that specifically supported older people, a lot of their volunteers were in the at-risk groups, so they of course couldn't do some of the face-to-face volunteering themselves. This talk is going to look at our learning around volunteering in the 6 months round about up to the start of October 2020, when I had the last discussions with delivery partners. Although, as with so many things at the moment, it feels a bit like it's all changing again as we speak. From April 2020, we started to run weekly, what we called Time to Learn Zoom sessions with our delivery partners. They were a reinstatement of what had originally been monthly meetings, where we learnt from the experiences of those delivery partners, and they were able to share notes and exchange ideas. They started as a chance for them to catch up with each other and to share specific current experiences, and I think were very valued by those staff. Some of them were in organisations where other members of staff had been furloughed and they needed the support. But over the summer, they evolved to look at specific topics, many of which were suggested by those delivery partners. And in July this year, we started to produce weekly learning briefings as a result of those meetings. At a wider networking meeting in August, we started to think about issues around volunteering, and there was definitely an appetite to discuss that. So we then organised to happen in September and the beginning of October 3 specific meetings about volunteering in those organisations, and that's what I want to share with you today. Just to give you some context, Time Shine worked with a mixture of delivery partners, some large organisations which were running projects funded over several years, and a lot of small projects which were running over 6 months or a year and which addressed specific issues. And we invited people from all of those organisations to take part. So some of them were reflecting on very small organisations, others were part of larger organisations, and many of them were what are known as neighbourhood networks in Leeds. Leeds has a neighbourhood network, roughly ward based, but one neighbourhood network for each ward, more or less. Of course, geography never seems to quite keep up with real life, but it means that every older person in Leeds is looked after by one of these neighbourhood networks if they need help and assistance. And they receive core funding from Leeds City Council, and then funding from additional sources as well, depending on what they want to do. Most of them are run by committees of older people themselves, and they all have different local priorities. And from September, we returned to working with any organisations who were supporting older people in Leeds. So these findings reflect what people have told us from a range of different older people's organisations in the city. I started by asking people what their volunteers had done and what had happened. So when we looked at it, most organisations had volunteers supporting them in 3 or 4 different work streams. And then what happened to each of those groups of volunteers was different. So they had office-based volunteers who took phone calls, helped with paperwork and record keeping in normal times. They were just asked not to come in straight away, as organisations needed to limit the numbers of people working in office buildings. Most of them were charities, they all had quite small spaces. A lot of these volunteers were older. Have you just lost my screen?
Yes, Jessica, we did.
Hang on again, I'll try it again because I don't know why it's disappeared. Is that back?
Yep, it's back. Thank you.
Right, okay, not sure what happened there. Yeah, so they had to stop the office volunteers coming in straight away because of risks to the volunteers and to the staff, and partly at least because nobody was quite sure at that point what was going on. They also, of course, used a lot of volunteers to support with events and activities, so they would help with practical arrangements, you know, run coffee mornings, support older people to get to things. And as all these events were cancelled with immediate effect, this volunteer work was paused as well. Some organisations had drivers and what they call bus buddies, so they might have their own minibus. They'd organise their own transport, or they'd have volunteers who helped with community transport minibuses. They were almost all asked to stop volunteering again because some of them were older. Partly, of course, a lot of the minibuses had stopped because they weren't bringing people to events. But some volunteers were shared with other organisations to help with emergency food deliveries and that sort of thing. And I think occasionally emergency helping people to medical appointments. So there was a limited amount of work still, in inverted commas, a limited amount of volunteering for drivers. And then the fourth group were befriending volunteers. They were mostly, before COVID-19 crisis, befriending people in their own homes. But of course that could no longer happen. So they were almost all moved to telephone befriending. And I think some volunteers out of the other categories became telephone befrienders as well. But a lot of people who'd volunteered in other categories, so in the office perhaps, didn't particularly want to do the befriending. It wasn't what they'd started to do. So some people were able to shift their volunteering. A number of the telephone befriendees actually took on extra sort of group members, and I think for quite a lot of the neighbourhood networks now, they actually ring all of their members monthly, and some people get more frequent phone calls. So during the emergency, what happened straight away was that the City Council quickly identified and funded voluntary organisations to act as leaders or local hubs to coordinate emergency help for residents. Some of these were neighbourhood networks, so they were older people's organisations. Some of them were other community-based organisations. But if they were, the neighbourhood networks often worked very closely with those ward hubs. So that was very practical volunteering, shall I say. So lots of that was doing emergency food delivery, collecting people's prescriptions, very sort of active volunteering. Volunteers took on a lot of telephone befriending at that point, not just for older people who were unable to leave their homes, but for younger people who were shielding as well and who wanted support. We certainly found a number of the organisations. I think Age UK had a face-to-face befriending service. They were able to transition almost all of their volunteers to becoming telephone befrienders. They were able to recruit a few more people who wanted befriending, but they actually found that they were unable to extend the service as far as they would have liked to, because the people who were doing the befriending couldn't take on any more people, and the staff who were looking after the befrienders just reached capacity because those befrienders needed a bit more support themselves. That was quite an interesting finding. They discovered that quite a lot of the people who were doing the befriending had then been put onto furlough. So in theory they had more time, but in practice they became anxious themselves and they needed more moral support. They weren't just able to go straight into a high gear of doing lots more volunteering. They did also discover that for some people, befriending other people on the telephone actually gave them a feeling of purpose, as volunteering so often does, and it was quite supportive to them that they were making these check-in calls to people and they were able to be helpful and do something during the crisis. To say, some organisations were able to repurpose volunteers or encourage group members to step up to volunteering. So I've made a little note there to say that it was the SAGE project. The SAGE project in Leeds is an LGBTQ project. They were able to move a lot of their members onto a meeting via Zoom digitally, and some of the members were able to step up to help other people to get digitally connected and to help the staff sort of run those meetings. So they started by meeting monthly face to face. They began digitally once a fortnight, and then when people found it really helpful, some of the volunteers stepped up, so they're now able to meet weekly, and that's going to continue, I think. That massively reduced the load on staff members and enabled them to make sure that they were taking best care of the really vulnerable people. So that worked really well. And in some organisations where staff were undertaking face-to-face garden visits, socially distanced walking and that sort of thing, volunteers were also encouraged to undertake this role, following the appropriate risk assessments. For some organisations, they didn't move back to any face-to-face contact. Carers Leeds was one of those at that point, because risk assessments meant they just didn't want to come face-to-face with anybody because of extra risks to the physical health of the person that was being cared for, really. So they just did a lot of telephone befriending. The organisations who'd become ward hub leads had many specific physical tasks that needed doing, as I said, so delivering food parcels, collecting prescriptions, and they were able to undertake some of these with their existing volunteers, and they were also able to recruit large numbers of local volunteers, often younger people who'd been furloughed from workplaces, through a partnership programme which Voluntary Action Leeds and the Leeds City Council ran, called Leeds Community Care Volunteers. It worked as a collection point for volunteers, so people could apply to be a volunteer, and Val processed the paperwork that was needed, and then hubs were able to call on people local to themselves. This has been really great, and I think organisations are finding this has actually changed the age profile of their volunteers. They're still not quite sure how many of them are going to be able to stick. Obviously, some people have had to go back to their normal workplaces now, but a reasonable number of them are continuing contact with that organisation, even if they're not doing day-to-day volunteering anymore. I think they're going to stay part of those volunteer teams, which is really good. Right, okay. Right, whilst volunteers were on pause, volunteers who were asked to stop were still being supported by staff in the organisations where they had volunteered. This generally seems to have been through telephone calls, but some organisations have started to offer face-to-face meetings in secure settings like cafes. Obviously they haven't since I wrote this, and they're not meeting each other face-to-face, but they were about 2 weeks ago. And I think they'll go back to that, so they're sort of able to meet generally off the charity's premises. Most people haven't been able to reopen their premises for one reason or another. Some organisations where they're not meeting people face to face have set up closed Facebook groups or closed WhatsApp groups, so those volunteers can chat to each other to try and replicate at least part of that social aspect of volunteering. Obviously that only works for those people who are happy to use digital, but it is there for them. As I say, some volunteers who were able to undertake roles like befriending were on furlough during this first part of the pandemic, and some of them did need quite a bit of additional support as the process went on and they became more anxious. Overall, volunteer organisations are still demonstrating quite a bit of concern for their inactive volunteers, and there are still a lot of inactive volunteers, especially in the older age groups, because it's very difficult to ask them to come back to do things with the risk assessments around it. People are continuing to give support to those volunteers, although we're not quite sure how long that will carry on working for, really, because volunteers have not only lost their active role, but they have lost some of that social benefit as well. Right, we then had a bit of a look between us at volunteers and risk. This was really important because of for a lot of the older people's organisations had a lot of older volunteers. There were a lot of people in their 60s and 70s who were still very active and were running the organisations really, who were then suddenly by the government told to stay at home. But what seems to have happened in terms of the risk appetite is that the organisations that were operational throughout as emergency hubs seem to have more appetite for risk. But we're not quite sure whether that's really appetite for risk or whether it would be fairer to say that because they've remained operational safely, they're now clearer about how to continue to undertake activity and manage risk at the same time. Because they'd had volunteers helping them the whole way through and they'd worked out a lot of protocols. Whereas for those organisations who'd had to stop completely, it was quite challenging for them to start up again, which in a way that felt like it was almost from scratch. As I say, hubs had been able to call on large numbers of younger volunteers, which was one way to reduce the exposure of older volunteers to risk. There is some anxiety about how they're going to manage over winter as many younger volunteers have gone back to work. I'm not quite sure what's happening at the moment. I haven't had a chance to talk to people. I know they've talked about extending furlough, but I think they still don't know who will and won't be working from now on, really, depending on different organisations. There seems to be some tension between frontline staff and boards and senior management teams, especially for some of the larger organisations, regarding what needed to be done or could be done safely. In general, staff told me that boards and senior management teams seem to be more risk averse. In small organisations who'd been running hubs with very few staff, the volunteers had continued to play a very large role, partly because they had to. There was nobody else to do it. In larger organisations, especially those that focus solely on older people, where many of the volunteers were themselves older and were stood down from their normal roles, activity had been reduced drastically anyway, and they didn't have the same need for volunteers. We're not quite sure. This might reflect the same dichotomy that I think staff are now seeing expressed by their older members, who are either very anxious about going out and going back to doing things as normal, who just want to reject these new restrictions and continue to meet, and who, although Leeds was about to head into tier 3, there were lots of people saying, I'm still going to cafes, I'm still going to pubs. So there seems to be a divide really between those who want to stick to rules and those people who've absolutely had enough. There are some practical issues around, or we found some practical issues around the restart of volunteering. It's been quite variable for different organisations. There are issues around control of spaces. So some organisations have got back to running, or had got back to running small lunch clubs, exercise classes, and doing some one-to-one advice sessions. But this control of venues seems to be a major predictor. So those organisations who are able to reopen tend to be those who have large venues and who have control or sole use of it themselves. Organisations with quite small venues have found that they just can't get enough people in them to make things function. And then there are other people whose venues are controlled by perhaps a church or the local authority, where the building controller won't let them do things because of their risk assessments. Some organisations had started to work out if they could use other facilities, so whether they could start to get groups meeting in perhaps a large local cafe. Again, this has gone on hold for now, but people I think are very much pausing that rather than stopping it altogether. I think hopefully if we come out of this at the start of December, they will go back to using those local meeting spaces, but just having to have very small meetings. It'll be that, or there'll be nothing till the end of March probably. Staff capacity seems to be the thing restricting the number of telephone befrienders available. Some staff were working towards signing people off as friends, but the restrictions when we went into tier 2 and then tier 3 altered how we could use that approach. It meant that people could carry on, could befriend people and meet them in a cafe or meet them in their garden as a charitable act, which would have been okay. So they could sign them off, because then they wouldn't have been able to meet at all. It all got a bit complicated. Transport remains a massive limitation. I'm sure it's exactly the same in Bristol. It was really difficult to reopen even with quite small numbers of volunteers coming to things like lunch clubs, because you needed to get them there, and that meant either fitting a very small number of people into minibuses. People are too far away to walk, because it's the frailest people who probably still need to come to the lunch club. You don't want to put them in taxis because that's not very safe either. So it just got really complicated. And I would say it's one of the things delivery partners want to discuss with us. But I think it's probably just because they don't know what to do, and we don't know what to do either. It's a big stumbling block. Then there are some of the practical issues around health issues affecting volunteers, or the health issues affecting people they care for. This obviously affects their personal appetite for risk. I think there's also been some restrictions around the urgency of dealing with things in the first 6 months and the capacity to plan. So ideally, for some of the older volunteers, it would be great to be able to get people back into helping people out, especially because staff can't keep on doing things forever. But it's really difficult for people to replan that while they're actually delivering in an emergency. So I think I'm hoping that will happen as things roll forward, because it's quite difficult to replan what you want your volunteers to do and then retrain them, especially when it might all change again. So I think there are several issues that are going to come up, and organisations are starting to get to grips with some of these, and we will hopefully revisit these stories as the whole thing progresses. So one of them is going to be keeping up with those old volunteers. I don't mean old in the sense of older, I mean old in the sense of did volunteering and have been asked to stop temporarily. I suspect from anecdotal evidence from at least some of the partners we've spoken to, some of those volunteers have found themselves something else to do, so they might not come back. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Some organisations are now starting to recruit and train new volunteers because they need people for posts they didn't have volunteers in before, so more telephone befriending, helping people sort things out with digital, that sort of thing. And they're starting to get to grips with working out how to do that remotely. And then I think there are going to be these issues around losing furloughed volunteers. That might be less of an issue than we thought as the furlough situation's just changed, but we'll see. And I think there are some sort of gaps in this story that people haven't quite started to look at yet, and I should be really interested to find out what else has been talking about. I think there's a gap around volunteers working from home or in non-contact roles. The organisations that I've been working with don't seem to have asked volunteers to work from home or been able to, and I think they could almost probably do with being able to do that. I've seen in other places, in other parts of the country, perhaps where there's been less staff-run organisations, that volunteers have done a lot from their own homes, and that doesn't seem to have happened yet. I think we could do with more volunteers offering that digital support to people. Staff have been doing an amazing job getting older people online and doing things, but it's really, really time consuming, and people often need quite a bit of support on and off for a while they get used to it. And it would be positive to get more volunteers involved in that. I think there are some issues perhaps around the staff lacking confidence doing it themselves, and that makes it quite hard to train other people to do it. And the third it's not exactly a gap, it's an issue, and it's something that people brought up in the meeting, staff from other organisations. This, you know, we've started with co-production. Everything we run is more or less co-produced, and the same for all these older people's organisations. Their boards are older people, they're run by older people, and because of the age profile and risk profile of the pandemic, what seems to have happened is we've said to people, you can't take this risk. We're not going to let you take this risk, even where people want to. So we're stopping them from volunteering, and that feels really uneasy to some people. Don't think we've got an answer to it, but it's definitely something people were thinking. It's like we've suddenly become a bit patronising and a bit, oh no, you can't do that. So that's the end of my talk. I think there's a lot more questions than there are answers, but it's been interesting getting these reflections from some of my colleagues in these organisations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for a really fascinating presentation. I think you've given some really valuable insights into the way in which the volunteering role has shifted and changed during the COVID emergencies and lockdowns, and some of the tensions, new tensions that have arisen as a result of those changes. We'll come back to this topic with the questions, if that's okay.
Yep.
I'll now ask Elsa if Elsa can rejoin us.
Okay.
Hi, Elsa.
Hi. It's
great to see you.
Well, great to see you too. It was a complete failure, this end. It just stopped working.
We can hear you loud and clear now. So I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Okay. Right, apologies for that. I've moved rooms. I've had to log back on. Let's hope it works this time. So I was giving you the background to the project. The work took place in 2018, so before COVID, and it was very much about learning the lessons. So we wanted to find out what roles volunteers play in social care settings for older people. We wanted to understand the motivations of managers, of volunteer coordinators. We wanted to talk to older people being supported by volunteers and volunteers themselves. So the work was undertaken in 7 organisations in the Southwest, and we used in-depth interviews and we talked with managers, volunteer coordinators, volunteers, paid staff and older people. And this slide just gives you a sense of the sample. So we went to 7 settings and they're all very different. So the first setting was a retirement village that had a very long tradition of working with volunteers, and the volunteers provided a befriending scheme. At site 2, it was a day centre where volunteers helped run activities, including quizzes and crafting sessions. Site 3 was another day centre, but specifically targeted one community group. And here the emphasis was more on social engagement, friendship, and reducing isolation for some of the community. Site 4 was a volunteer agency that ran physical and musical activity sessions in residential care homes. And then we had a care home where the volunteers ran reading groups, activities, and carried out spiritual visits. Site 6 was a national charity that ran a hospital discharge service. And here the volunteers met with older people who'd recently been discharged from hospital and supported them to re-engage in their social life. So maybe accompanying them on walks or to activities that they used to take part in. And finally, Site 7 was a time bank that set up a lunch club, and the impetus for that came from members of the community who were concerned that there wasn't a lot going on for older people in the neighbourhood. So when we talk to older people, their perspectives on the role of volunteers, the vast majority of them gave really glowing accounts of those volunteers that they came into contact with and talked about the close friendships that they developed. So in this quote, an older person who attended one of the activity programs run by a volunteer said of the volunteer, "She fills our day. She gives you something to look forward to. These people that do these jobs, they're a certain character. She's just one of them. So we look forward to Wednesday. We try not to miss them if we can help it." And there was a real sense, a palpable sense of volunteers helping to reduce loneliness and isolation. And particularly for older people living in residential care, there was a sense of the volunteers bringing the outside perspective into their setting, which was greatly appreciated. Now, there were different perspectives on the role of volunteers amongst paid workers and managers. So on the one hand, there was agreement that the volunteer brought added value to a service. So one of the care workers at the care home said, "It gives our resident a better quality of care. It gives them more opportunities. It enables them to have more one-to-one time with someone." So it's a real sense of the volunteers adding to what was already available. But on the other hand, managers were acutely aware of the need to provide support to volunteers, particularly if they were going to work one-to-one with potentially vulnerable older people. So a manager at a day centre for the minority community recognised this when she said, with volunteering one-to-one, you need to have a proper job description, a volunteer organiser who can look at the training, do all the checks with them, do everything. No matter what training I offer the volunteers in the day centre, I would still not be comfortable in sending them to work one-to-one. So one way in which the case study organisation differed was in relation to the nature of the contribution that volunteers made at each setting. So there were sites where the volunteer role primarily augmented or enhanced the existing service. So this included the befriending service in the retirement village and the volunteer agency which delivered exercise or musical activities. On the other hand, volunteers at some sites were used sometimes to fill gaps in provision, particularly in instances of short staffing. And this appeared to happen most often in the 2 day centres and the care home that we visited, where volunteers worked alongside paid members of staff. And in other cases, the volunteers provided a discrete service that was freestanding, and they rarely came into contact with paid workers. So the Home from Hospital service and the Lunch Club both provided examples of these discrete services. Now, where the volunteers augmented or provided a discrete service, their roles often had very clear boundaries, delineating the contribution of volunteers from the contribution of paid staff. And this was particularly clear at the retirement village, where one worker said, "A volunteer is more of a companion, whereas we're the ones who do the personal care. We do the intimate things, we do the medication. I would never expect a volunteer to do that. I would say that they enhance people's lives more, especially if they haven't got any relatives or friends that visit them very often." Now, in contrast to that, in those cases where the volunteers appeared to fill gaps in provision, it was much less clear what distinguished their role from that of the paid workers. So a volunteer at one of the day centres said, "It's not official, but sometimes I think we're treated as, I'm not saying this like it's a bad thing, I'm saying we're treated like cover if a member of staff happened to be out, like because of holiday or sick leave or things like that. But if everyone's in, we're usually just extra helping hands." key finding that's emerged from the data was the importance of the volunteer coordinator role. And it might have been called different things at different sites, but it was someone essentially whose role it was to support and sort of oversee the volunteer contribution. Now, some organisations had a site-specific volunteer coordinator, some relied on a regional coordinator, and some didn't have a volunteer coordinator at all. Now, where they did exist, most were responsible for the recruitment and possibly the training and day-to-day management of volunteers. And when we spoke to the volunteers themselves, they spoke of the volunteer coordinators almost as if they were a kite mark. They described their presence as something that had swayed their decision to volunteer at that organisation. So as you can see from this quote from a volunteer, the coordinator was key to their decision to volunteer. The coordinator role appeared to provide some structure to the volunteer programme. As the volunteer said, I think if you're dealing with someone who's trying to pick that up amongst other things, the worry is that you won't feel like you're needed as a volunteer. And I knew when I phoned here, someone called me back and they had the time to talk me through the whole process, invite me to come in, sit down and talk to them. It felt professional because there were forms to fill in. They did the proper checks. So it appeared that for some volunteers, the existence of a volunteer coordinator role added a legitimacy to the volunteer endeavour, which was an important motivation in getting involved. Now, for several years or several decades, there's been an assumption largely made on behalf of government ministers that there is this army of volunteers that are waiting to be drawn upon. And so Norman Lamb said in 2014, there's a great army of people out there. If you can somehow tap the energy and commitment that they're prepared to give, you may start to find some of the solutions to the challenges we face. And he was particularly talking about the kind of challenging times for social care provision. But our study didn't find that. In fact, even at settings where they had a long tradition of working with volunteers, we were told that they were struggling, and this was back in 2018, to recruit volunteers. And a range of reasons were offered for that. People told us about increased intergenerational care, so the pressure to support and care for one's own family, changes to the state pension age, and so fewer people were retiring early and looking for things to do. And we were told specifically in rural areas that they were experiencing, or the organisations we spoke to, they were experiencing difficulties recruiting, partly because of the kind of travel to recruitment opportunities. And the first quote here illustrates some of these problems. The volunteer coordinator at Site 1, where they had worked with volunteers for many decades, said, "We just find that those retired, well, most women are working in some capacity now, or they're having to stop their volunteering because grandchildren come along and they have to take on caring responsibilities." And the situation had got so difficult that the hospital discharge service, which was based in a rural area, had made the decision to recruit a paid worker to work alongside volunteers. So in that sense, a paid worker was substituting for volunteers, and that worker focused on the more complex and challenging cases. But that was a real departure for this national charity because they always ran their services with volunteers. Another key theme that emerged from the data was the importance of supporting and valuing volunteers. So I've already said that the data suggests that this is easier to do when you've got a volunteer coordinator or someone providing a focus and some structure to the programme. Most of the volunteers we spoke to felt appreciated by the organisations where they volunteered, and they felt valued by the paid workers that they worked alongside and the older people that they worked with. And when we asked them why they felt valued, they told us about the small tokens. So people knowing their names, saying hello, being invited to the annual Christmas party or an annual volunteer recognition event. All of these things help demonstrate the value that people placed in their volunteering activity, and that was appreciated. So the literature talks about volunteers, and it says that one of the motivations is around training, that many volunteers decide to volunteer because they want to get an opportunity to develop new skills through training. But again, our study suggested this wasn't the case for all volunteers. So 3 of the 7 sites provided no training to their volunteers. At the remaining 4 sites, they all had quite extensive training programs, and at 2 of these sites, that training program was really well received by the volunteers, and they spoke very enthusiastically about the training and were very appreciative of it. However, across the other sites, training didn't appear to be a strong motivation for people's involvement. In fact, several volunteer coordinators and managers told us that training was often perceived as a burden and sometimes led to volunteers ending their involvement with programs. We were also told that if volunteers had to wait a long time before completing their initial training, then that was a strong possibility that they would find alternative volunteering opportunities. So across the sites, there's a mixed picture, but there was a real sense of the need to capture the enthusiasm of new volunteers and complete initial training in a timely manner. Now, as this slide suggests, there were specific problems associated with organisations arranging additional compulsory training. And at this site, a manager told us that at various points in the last few years, we've lost volunteers en masse because of assistance on compulsory training. And we've lost good volunteers. They just had enough and they went. Because the thing is, we'll pay them to come here to do the training, but we're not paying them for their time. And this charity that provided the hospital discharge service had recently arranged for all volunteers across the country in all of their volunteer programs to take part in compulsory safeguarding training over and above what they previously received. And this really had been received badly by the volunteers. In fact, quite a few of them told us that they didn't have the time to attend the training and that they didn't want to attend the training, whilst others said they hadn't found it very useful and others found it very patronising. But there'd been this very strong reaction to this additional training. So what our research demonstrates is that volunteering brings many benefits to older people's social care organisations. It also brings benefits to the volunteers themselves and the organisations where they volunteer. But there are a range of challenges associated with their involvement. And we started to talk about almost the sense of a volunteer paradox. And what we're trying to capture here is that at the very time when social care organisations are under increasing pressure because of the financial context in which they're working. They are under more pressure to engage more volunteers, to keep the show on the road, if you like. But the actual experiences that volunteers are having is much more tricky because of the wider stresses and strains that the social care agencies are working under. And this feeling was exemplified by this manager of a volunteer programme, who said, "I think that the cuts in social care have a direct effect on services that is either putting a load of pressure or just closing down services. And then when you get a service that's under stress and under pressure, it's not a good place for a volunteer to be if everybody's rushing around, you know, trying to provide care on an impossible amount of money. There's a knock-on effect on how you then get volunteers, how you care for volunteers. I think the casualty of the cutback definitely is impacting on volunteers. And you know, I don't, but this big thing about if we could replace people with volunteers, I think it's an insane idea. It's irresponsible. So our research evidences that volunteers make an important contribution to social care for older people. But I think that there's some education that needs to take place. I don't think volunteers should be seen as a free resource. And on that basis, we've got some suggestions for commissioners. And I think the first issue is the need to educate commissioners about the costs and the challenges associated with working with volunteers, and specifically having a coordinator role, which appeared to be really important to the volunteers we spoke to. And in our view, that role needs to be properly funded. A coordinator role appears to be essential in supporting volunteers, and therefore it contributes to the quality of the social care interaction. So, for example, coordinators were usually the route through which volunteers were recruited. They were involved in organising and sometimes delivering training. And most importantly, they were supporting volunteers when volunteers were struggling with the work that they were carrying out, worried about the people that they were working with. It was the volunteer coordinators who supported them. And all of these elements are important in terms of ensuring the quality of the volunteer contribution. And of course, it should be the quality of service that is at the forefront of any decision made by commissioners. So I think that there's a principle about educating commissioners and kind of ensuring that volunteer coordinator roles are properly funded and resourced. And in relation to the providers of services, I think we need to be clear about the aim of the volunteer contribution and the boundaries between the volunteer roles and other roles. What is it that we're expecting volunteers to do, and how is that different to the role of paid members of staff? And in terms of training, I hope that we can agree that all volunteers contributing to social care need to have some basic training. However, this needs to be reflective of and proportional to the work that they're doing. It also needs to be timely and accessible. So although volunteers need training about the protection of vulnerable adults, they might only need to know enough to be able to recognise the signs and then what to do about them. So thank you. That's it.
Elsa, a very big thank you for another really interesting and insightful presentation. Some further insights into the opportunities and benefits of volunteering, as well as the tensions and challenges at service level, but also at that commissioning and funding level as well. So your work here really complements the messages from Jessica's presentation as well. Jessica's talking about some of the challenges on the ground in terms of changes to services during the last 12 months or so. So thank you both very much. Just before we move to questions from our audience, I just want to mention that we have got a short survey online. Claire is now going to pop a link to that survey in the chat box. You can click on that now, or you can come back to it at the end of the seminar. And Claire will also send out the link to you via the email that you registered for this event. So it'd be really great if you had time to fill in that short questionnaire either today or later on in the week, just so we can get a good idea of who comes to the seminars, who's missing from the seminars, and perhaps who we need to reach out to as key members of our audience, and also any suggestions for topics for our 2021 program as we start to think about this. So thank you, Claire. So let's open up to questions, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Gary Christopher from UWE. Gary, over to you.
Yeah, I've got a, obviously, if you want to carry on posting questions, then please do. I'm trying to keep a track of them now, but a couple of questions for Jessica, if we go back to Jessica first of all. I think this is a question from Paul, in fact. If a carer befriending service has not resumed in person, what would be the impact on carers?
I imagine it would be quite detrimental, really. I mean, I think they've been very careful at replacing it with telephone befriending, and I think the telephone befriending sometimes is more frequent than the face-to-face befriending. But I can imagine it will be devastating for people, because it was often their opportunity to actually get out of the house, which it's been hard enough for people who are trapped at home on their own, but I think it's harder really for carers, especially where they're caring very intensively, perhaps for someone with dementia. They just need a bit of a break. I think, yeah, that it's just going to have to wait though, because I think some of the time the feedback we've been getting from carers leads is that even though I think they've been offered additional funding at times for sort of respite care so that carers can still get out, carers are even more reluctant than usual to take that, because they just don't want to leave anybody else with the person that's cared for, and they don't want to take the risk of letting somebody else into the house. So even though technically it would be allowed under all the regulations, you still have that personal risk factor that you don't know where that person's been, and so on and so forth. So yeah, challenge.
Thank you very much. I've got another question, so you can stay, keep your mic on. Did any of the volunteers extend the virtual video meetings to the people they were supporting? It's a comment from Jenny Ann in North Wales LGBT+ community.
Okay. They had regular group meetings weekly. I think they've been meeting in small groups via Zoom. I think some of them are now meeting individually that way, and they've, you know, linked up over the telephone. They were about to start, and the LGBT group Sage was really keen on restarting local visits in cafes and things as well, or restarting in the city centre, and they were one of the organisations where there was a lot of tension between the staff on the ground and the staff at sort of management level, partly because it's an older people's project that's actually in a charity which was set up to deal with younger people. It's a charity called MESMAC, and it was set up around younger people's sexual health for the LGBT community, and they're really anxious about older people because they don't have very much experience of older people. So that was causing some tensions. So yeah, and Tracy, their worker, described them as party animals. They were just desperate to get out and meet each other. So, but if you want to know more about Sage and what they do and get up to, then do get in touch with me as well directly. That would be great. Does that answer your question, Jenny Ann?
I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Shall we? Has anyone got any questions then for Elsa? Ooh, what's this? Who's this one for? Okay, so how do you think? This could be open to both of you. How do you think the increase in informal volunteering during the pandemic will affect organisations' ability to recruit formal volunteers in the future? So either one of you.
I can envisage it helping, that people have experienced volunteering, enjoyed it, got something positive out of it, and might look for other opportunities. But I think what we know from, particularly from my perspective in social care settings, you're reliant on the kind of consistent involvement. So the regular involvement where it's built into services. And I'm not sure that those are the same people that have been volunteering in the last 6 months or so. So yes, I don't know which way it's going to go.
Yeah, I think I would probably feel the same. I think it is always very difficult or more difficult to recruit volunteers who you need to be there every Tuesday morning without fail than it is to recruit people who are happy to flex. We found we were involved at LOPF in training interim telephone volunteers, and a number of those have carried on volunteering after the interim scheme finished, and we've managed to pair them up with other organisations. But that's ideal in terms of flexibility, because they were often they were able to arrange their own time to meet the person they were telephone befriending, and although it generally wasn't out of hours, it's been easier for people to fit back into their lives, I think. I'm not sure as well how much the mutual aid type volunteers are going to be overly keen on being made to do safeguarding training and all the other things that they really, really do need to do, but that organisations have managed to get away without doing because of the emergency.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you both. I've got another question then for both of you. So whoever wants to go first on this one. This is an important one. How do we look after volunteers better? How do we ensure that we retain them going forward?
It's a very good question. I mean, I do think that volunteers knowing that they have support structures behind them is crucial to that. So it's that sense of not just being valued, but having some security, having some support. That to me is really important, particularly in my field where it is challenging. Services are working in increasingly difficult circumstances, and people are reporting that. So I think it's really necessary that we invest in support for volunteers.
Yes, I entirely concur with that, really. It's that support that people need. They need to know they're not doing it on their own. And I come from sort of that volunteer manager background, and I'm 100% with that one.
Great, excellent. Thank you both again. Any last minute questions from anyone? Keeping an eye on the chat window. Doesn't look like any more questions at the moment, but I'm sure the presenters will be happy to kind of take questions later.
Oh, is there a question from Liz?
Can I ask it out loud?
No.
Well, because I'm just trying to save time. I'm just thinking that we're likely to face more cuts to services. And I'm kind of thinking that maybe the division between volunteers as augmenters of service and volunteers as gap fillers is going to become very much more blurred. I mean, it already is quite blurred, isn't it? If you think, they're augmenting services that have been run down, are they becoming more gap fillers, do you think? And is that likely to be worse now after the pandemic?
Yes, I think it will get far worse. I think that boundary will become much more blurry. I think where they're being used in discrete services, I also think that's problematic as well, because it's almost a kind of, we'll disinvest from this service and volunteers can fill that gap. So I do think it's going to be really challenging over the next few years. And we do need to keep an eye on it. We do need to be holding commissioners and I don't say that badly, because commissioners are in a difficult situation, but we need to be very clear about what we need to support volunteers, and also that they don't stray into areas that are more tricky.
It looks like I have one more question if we've got time for that. Well, it might be a comment, actually. I think it might be just a comment. Sorry, I jumped in too quickly then. I shall hand it over to you, Paul.
Great. Unless, Fran, did you want to make your comment in person, just as a final comment or question?
Yes, thank you. I'm a relatively new volunteer, and I really wanted to underline the importance that Ailsa's described of having confidence in the organisation that's recruited me, which I happily have, very much so, because it feels safe for the, I'm a telephone befriender, it helps to make it feel safe for the individual who's being befriended, for the befriender, and also for the organisation that inevitably will carry some degree of can if something major goes wrong. And I think that's really, really important. I've written over the last few years several references for friends who have wanted to be volunteers for various organisations, and some of them have been put off by the lack of sense of professionalism that the organisation manifests, and have dropped out. Whereas I feel I've been extremely fortunate to get into something that is really well run, but certainly values volunteers, gives appropriate training, has got a volunteer coordinator, effectively is all the things that Ailsa is describing as sort of best practice.
Good.
Thank you, Fran. And I think hearing your perspective as a volunteer is a really strong note to end on as well. So thank you for sharing that. That's great. Well, a big thank you again, Jessica and Ailsa, for sharing your reflections and your messages from research. It's been a really fascinating presentation seminar. And as I mentioned before, you've both really given some in-depth and valuable insights into what the challenges were around volunteering pre-COVID, and of course during COVID-19 as well. So it's like you both kind of teed this up to make this work in that way, which is great. There is a hand up. Has someone got one very, very final question? Who is it that's got their hand up? I'm just trying to find you. Can you see who that is, Gary? Okay, what we might do, Ailsa and Jessica, just while I'm talking, would you mind writing your email address in the chat box?
Yep,
is that okay to share with people? And then what people can do, if you've got further questions or comments, feel free to get in touch with Ailsa and Jessica directly.
Yeah, I think I've shared it with Claire as well, but we produce some learning briefings which she can certainly pass on to people, which contain a bit more information than was in my talk.
Wonderful, that's great. And keep an eye out for an email from Claire, which will let everybody know when the recorded presentation is available. If people want to share that or come back and look at it again. Jessica's just put her email in the chat box there if people want to make a note of that. And also just another reminder that Claire will be circulating the survey link as well. It's just a short survey online just to get some feedback from everybody attending about how you found the seminar and who you are, what your background is, and also what topics you'd like us to address next year as we start to plan for 2021. So we'll be back in touch. We have everyone's contact details. We'll be in touch over email about the program for next year. So please keep an eye out for that. It's great to see everybody here today, and it's never too early to wish everybody a very safe and Merry Christmas. So we'll see you in 2021. Thank you all. Have a great day.